This is a May Luna Media production.
Welcome to the Synaptic Soul podcast, where science meets spirit and they totally make out. I'm Ava Marie Anderson, your quantum-loving, spiritually savage bestie, here to prove your energy isn't mystical, it is measurable. And oh, quick heads up, if you hear snoring or grunting or a dramatic sigh mid-download, that is not a ghost in the machine. It's just my Frenchie co-hosts, Rocky and Rambo, vibing at their own frequency. Let's dive in. There is something deeply unsettling and also wildly validating about the fact that when scientists map the structure of the universe, it looks eerily similar to the structure of your brain. And I'm not talking metaphorically and I'm not talking poetically, but I'm saying structurally and mathematically and functionally. Like, we are talking about the cosmic web, this massive filament-like structure made of galaxies and dark matter and energy stretching across billions of light years. And when astrophysicists model it, what they see is a network, like nodes connected by strands and clusters exchanging information and energy and gravitational influence. And now zoom in, like way in, into the human brain, and what do you see? You see neurons and synapses and electrical impulses firing across a web of connections. It's information traveling and reorganizing and adapting. It's a system that is not static, but constantly rewiring itself in response to input. And then here's where it gets spicy. So a 2020 study compared these two systems, it's the brain and the universe, and found that despite operating on scales so fucking different that it's almost incomprehensible, they share similar levels of complexity and connectivity patterns and distribution of matter and energy. So let me just translate that into spiritual bestie language. So the same pattern that organizes your thoughts also organizes galaxies. And you know what? We need to pause here because this is where most people go, oh, that's cute, and then they move on. But no, this is not just aesthetic symmetry. This is a fundamental clue about how reality organizes itself, because in physics, when patterns repeat across scales, it's not random. It's called self-similarity, and it's a core property of fractals. And fractals are structures that repeat themselves at different levels of magnification. Like, think coastlines and snowflakes and lightning and blood vessels and tree branches. And now apparently your brain and the universe. So, like, what does it mean? Well, for me, it suggests that reality is not built as a separate layer, like this is the human level and this is the cosmic level. It suggests that reality is built on recursive patterns, meaning that the micro reflects the macro, and the macro reflects the micro, and everything is part of the same underlying architecture. And this is where science starts accidentally sounding like ancient spirituality, because this is literally the principle of as above, so below. Except now, instead of a mystic whispering it in a temple, we have astrophysicists going, wait just a fucking second. But let's go deeper into the brain itself. Like, your brain is not just a passive observer of reality. It is an active prediction machine. And modern neuroscience tells us that your brain is constantly generating models of the world based on past experiences and sensory input and expectations and emotional states. Like, it doesn't just receive reality, it guesses reality, and then it updates that guess in real time. And this is called predictive processing, which means what you're seeing right now, your environment, your body, your life, it is not raw objective truth. It is your brain's best interpretation of incoming data, and let that land. Because here's the thing. If your brain is building your version of reality, then two people can exist in the exact same environment and experience completely different worlds. Not metaphorically, but neurologically. And now let's layer in physics, because this is where things go from interesting to oh shit. In classic physics, the Newtonian model, we assumed that reality was fixed. solid objects, predictable outcomes, a universe that exists independently of you observing it. But then quantum physics said, oh, LOL, absolutely not. And at the quantum level, particles don't behave like solid things. They behave like wave functions, fields of probability, meaning a particle doesn't have a single defined state. It has multiple potential states until it's observed. This is the infamous observer effect. You've heard me talk about it before. And yeah, it is exactly as weird as it sounds. So particles literally behave differently when they are being measured, which has led physicists to a very uncomfortable realization. Observation is not passive. It plays a role in determining outcome. And now let's connect that back to your brain. So if your brain is constructing your perception of reality, and reality at its most fundamental level is not fixed until it's observed, then we are forced into a question that blurs the line between science and spirituality so fucking hard it basically erases it. What is the role of consciousness in shaping reality? Because here's the thing. Your brain is not separate from the universe. It's made of the same atoms. It's operating under the same physical laws. It's participating in the same energetic field. And so when your brain observes something, it's not as an outsider looking in. It is the universe interacting with itself. And then this is where we start to tilt into the spiritual without leaving the science, because if the same patterns that structure galaxies structure your thoughts, and if your perception is an internal simulation, if the observation affects reality at the quantum level, then we have to consider the possibility that consciousness is not just in the universe. Consciousness may be fundamental to it. And then suddenly you're not just a person with a brain. You are a localized node of awareness inside of a much larger network that looks suspiciously like the same thing. And now, I want to gently wreck you one more time before we close out this segment, because you've never experienced reality directly, not once. Everything that you have seen and touched and felt and remembered has been processed and filtered and constructed inside of your brain. Your entire life. It has taken place within a neural simulation. And before you spiral into nothing is real, let me just ground this. Your experience is real, and your emotions are real, and your life is real. But the way that you experience it, that's mediated, that is constructed, that is interpreted, which means that there is more flexibility here than you were ever taught. And that, my friends, is where we're going next, because if your brain is constructing your universe, then what you believe and what you focus on and what you expect might matter a hell of a lot more than you actually think. So now that we've established that the structure of the universe and the structure of the brain look suspiciously like they were designed from the same cosmic blueprint, we need to go one layer deeper into the real mind bender. It's that you are not actually experiencing reality directly. You are experiencing a model of reality that your brain is building for you in real time, which sounds dramatic, I know, but it's also just neuroscience. Your brain is basically the most advanced virtual reality headset in existence, except instead of charging you monthly and glitching during updates, it runs 24/7, and it is convinced you that its rendering is objective truth, and it is not. Your eyes do not see reality the way a camera sees reality. They collect light, and that's it. Tiny packets of electromagnetic information hit the retina, get converted into electrical signals, and then get sent off to the visual cortex, where your brain goes, perfect. I'll take it from here. And then from there, your brain fills in the gaps and smooths the edges and guesses depth and interprets color and prioritizes movement and then filters background noise and then constructs an image that it believes that is useful for survival. And useful, by the way, is the key word here. Not accurate, not complete, not ultimate truth, but useful. And this is one of the most important things people miss when they think about perception. Your nervous system is not designed to show you reality as it is. It is designed to show you reality in a way that keeps you alive long enough to pass on your genes, pay your fucking taxes, and develop at least 3 deeply unnecessary emotional attachments. Like, evolution did not prioritize enlightenment. It prioritized survival. So the reality that you experience is not raw existence. It is just a biologically efficient interface. So Donald Hoffman, this cognitive scientist, he's argued something similar. He says that evolution favors organisms that perceive what is useful, not what is objectively true. So in other words, your senses may function less like windows and more like icons on a desktop. So when you see a blue folder icon on your laptop, you know it represents something real in the machine, but it's not the thing itself. Like, you're not looking at a voltage state in binary architecture. You're looking at a symbol that your system created so that you can interact with complexity without losing your fucking mind. And that might be exactly what perception is. It's just a user interface. So let's pause real quick. Let's appreciate the absolute cosmic sass of this. Like, you spend your whole life thinking you are perceiving the world when in fact you are navigating a biologically generated dashboard. Like, you're not seeing the operating system. You're seeing the icons, which means reality as you know it is already symbolic before spirituality ever enters the room. And now, spirituality absolutely enters the room. It kicks off her shoes, it pours a drink, and it says, yeah, mystics have been saying this forever. Because what have spiritual traditions been telling us for thousands of years? That the world of appearances is not the full reality. That form is not the source. That the material world is filtered through consciousness. In Vedanta, this is Maya, the veil of illusion. In certain Buddhist frameworks, perception is conditioned and empty of fixed independent essence. In Hermetic thought, the visible world is a reflection of the deeper invisible laws. In mystical Christianity, the kingdom of heaven is within. And in countless indigenous traditions, reality is relational and alive and ensouled and responsive rather than inert and separate. And then science walks into the room and says, we have found evidence that perception is constructed, basically a model. And then mysticism lights a cigarette and goes, no fucking shit. And now, let's just make this even more beautiful. So if perception is constructed, then the brain is not merely receiving a world. It is participating in the creation of your experienced world. And this is where that predictive processing comes in. And honestly, this theory should have been at the forefront, basically, because it changes everything. So according to predictive processing, the brain is constantly making predictions about what it expects to encounter and then comparing the incoming sensory data against those predictions. So your experience of reality emerges then from that loop. Your brain guesses first, your senses second, and then it corrects itself as needed. So let's just say you walk into a dark room and you see something coiled on the floor. Your brain does not neutrally wait for the complete information like some calm little scholar. It goes snake and then it gets your heart rate involved immediately. And then if more data comes in and it turns out to be a hoodie on the floor, your brain then updates. But for a brief moment, your body was living inside a reality that your brain predicted into existence. And now scale that up. Like, your expectations, your memories, your traumas, your beliefs, and your identity all shape prediction, which means that the reality you experience is not just sensory. It's autobiographical, it's emotional, it's encoded by your past. Like, two people can stand in the same room and inhabit vastly different universes because their nervous systems are telling different stories about the meaning of what's happening. And that's neuroscience, yeah, but it's also shadow work. It's also manifestation. It's also why healing changes what life feels like before it changes what life looks like. So, when you regulate the nervous system and you challenge beliefs and you rewire perception, you are not simply becoming more positive. You're altering the model through which your reality is rendered. And this is why spirituality that ignores the body becomes fluff and science that ignores consciousness becomes sterile. Because the body is involved, the nervous system is involved, memory is involved, meaning is involved. Your reality is not merely physical. It is psychophysical, it is electrochemical, it is symbolic, and it is relational all at the same fucking time. And yeah, this is where we start bumping right up against quantum territory again, because what if what you experience is constructed reality? And what if reality at the smallest levels behaves probabilistically rather than deterministically? Then certainty starts to look really fucking shaky. Like the world may be less like a machine and more like an unfolding field of interpreted potential. Now, that doesn't mean that you can think a dragon into your kitchen, but it does mean that the observer is not irrelevant. Consciousness is not a decorative side effect. It appears to be entangled with experience in a way that science still doesn't fully understand. And spiritually, this is everything. Because if reality is mediated through perception, then your inner world is not separate from your lived world. The lens matters. The state of the observer matters. What you fear and expect and worship and rehearse and repeatedly identify with all become part of the architecture of experience. Your brain's not just watching your life, it is rendering it. And you know what? Maybe that's the sacred invitation here. Not to become delusional, but to become responsible and to understand that your perceptions are powerful, but they're not always true. That your mind is creative, but it's also conditioned. And that your suffering might be real while still being filtered through patterns that can be changed. And that, I don't know, maybe consciousness itself might be the holiest instrument you have. Because what if your brain is not just a survival machine? Like, what if it is a cosmos making organ? What if perception is not the opposite of spirituality, but the mechanism through which spirit experiences form? And what if the hallucination is not a flaw in the system, but just the very canvas of incarnation? Because that, my friends, is where we're going to head next. Now that we have opened the door to the brain as a reality rendering architecture, we need to talk about the observer effect and the quantum fields and whether consciousness is simply inside the universe or whether the universe itself is mind-like at its very core. All right. Now that we've established that your brain is essentially running a highly sophisticated, biologically optimized simulation of reality, we need to talk about the thing that makes physicists deeply uncomfortable and mystics go, yeah, obviously, and that's the observer effect. And this is the part where reality stops behaving like a solid, predictable machine and starts acting like it's been waiting for you to look at it before deciding what it is. So let's break this down without turning it into a textbook. So at the quantum level, particles like electrons and photons and the tiny little building blocks of everything, they don't behave like solid objects. They behave like wave functions, which is just a fancy way of saying that they exist as a spread of probability. So not one position and not one state. Multiple potential outcomes at the same time. Like, it's giving commitment issues, yes, but this all breaks down until they're measured. When a particle is observed or measured, that wave of probability collapses into a single defined state, meaning before observation, the particle is not one thing, it is many possible things. And after observation, it becomes one thing. And now here's where people start spiraling on TikTok and accidentally misinterpret this into you can think your dream life into existence instantly. Like, let's not do that. Because the observer effect doesn't mean that your ego is out here controlling the stock market with affirmations, but it does mean something deeply important. The act of measurement, of interaction, affects the system being observed. So reality is not completely independent of observation. Let that land for a second. Because in classical physics, we assumed the universe existed in a fixed objective state whether or not we were looking at it. And then quantum physics said actually is a little more complicated than that. But let's talk about the most famous experiment that illustrates this. This is the double slit experiment. And don't worry, I'm going to keep it digestible. So, scientists fired particles like electrons or photons at a barrier with two slits in it. If the particles behaved like solid objects, you'd expect them to go through one slit or the other, leaving two distinct lines on a screen behind, but that's not what happened. Instead, they created an interference pattern, a pattern that only happens when something behaves like a wave, not a particle. So, meaning the particles were acting like waves of possibility going through both slits at once. Like, cool, weird, already uncomfortable, but then they did something else. They placed a detector at the slits to observe which slit the particle actually went through, and then suddenly that interference pattern disappeared. The particles started behaving like solid objects again. One slit, one path, one outcome. So, just to recap, when unobserved, particles behave like waves, multiple possibilities. But when observed, particles behave like particles, one outcome. And this is where the physicists collectively go, what the actual fuck? Now, let's be very clear, because this is where nuance matters. The observer in physics does not necessarily mean a conscious human staring at it like, hey, bestie, collapse your shit into reality. It can mean any interaction with a measuring device or environment, but here's where it gets interesting. So, even when you remove human consciousness from the equation, you cannot fully separate information from the system. And some interpretations of quantum mechanics, like the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, suggest that consciousness itself may play a role in collapsing the wave function. Now, is that universally agreed upon? No. But does it open the door to some very spicy philosophical questions? Abso-fucking-lutely. Because now we're sitting at this very uncomfortable, very electric space where reality exists as potential, and interaction influences outcome, and observation is not neutral. And then we have to ask, what exactly counts as an observer? Is it just measuring equipment, or is it interaction, or is it awareness? So let's bring this back to you. Because if the universe at its smallest level is not fixed but probabilistic, and if your brain is constructing your experience of reality, then your role in reality is not passive. Like, you're not just out here floating through a pre-rendered universe like it's a Netflix show. You are participating in a system where perception filters experience, and interaction influences outcomes, and attention directs awareness. And this is where science and spirituality stop arguing and they start nodding at each other like, oh, we might actually be talking about the same thing, just in different languages. Because spiritually, this has been the conversation forever. The idea that consciousness is fundamental, that reality is not separate from awareness, and that the observer and the observed are not fully independent. Like in some non-dual philosophies, the distinction between subject and object dissolves entirely. There's no you looking at the universe. There is only experience happening. And now, before we all ascend into the astral plane mid-podcast, let's ground this. Like, it doesn't mean that you control everything and that reality is fake and nothing fucking matters. We're not doing nihilism today. But what we are doing is empowered awareness. Because what this does suggest is that reality is more interactive than we were taught. Less like a rigid machine and more like a dynamic system. More like a field. And in physics, we actually have language for this. It's quantum field theory. It tells us that what we think of as particles are actually excitations in underlying fields, meaning everything, literally everything, is part of a continuous energetic field. Not separate objects bumping into each other, but patterns emerging within a shared substrate. And now let's zoom all the way out. Like, you are a brain constructing a model of reality inside of a universe that behaves probabilistically, made of fields interacting with fields and participating in observation and interaction. And somehow we're all just still pretending we're separate from all this. Like, be so for real. Like, this is where we just drop the mic. Like, what if consciousness is not inside the universe? What if the universe is inside consciousness? Like, what if what we call reality is not something happening to you, but something happening through you? And listen, I'm not saying that you can just sit on your couch, visualize a Ferrari, and quantum leap into a different tax bracket overnight. Like, we still live in physical laws and biological constraints and systems that very much require you to show the fuck up and do the fucking things. But what I am saying is this. Your awareness matters. Your perception matters. Your relationship to reality matters. Because if reality is not fully fixed until it's engaged with, then how you engage with it is not irrelevant. And that's where we're going to go next, because now that we've cracked open the possibility that consciousness and reality are deeply intertwined, we have to ask the question that really just sends people into an existential spiral. And it's that, is the universe conscious? And if it is, what does that make you? All right, we have officially arrived at the question that makes scientists shift in their chairs and the spiritual baddies lean all the way forward like fucking finally we are talking about it. Is the universe conscious? Not metaphorically and not poetically, but literally. Because if we follow the breadcrumbs we've been laying down, and if we don't chicken out halfway through this conversation, this is where it leads. All right, let's recap the facts that we've already established so we're not out here vibing without receipts. We have a universe that at its most fundamental level behaves probabilistically, not deterministically. Like it exists as a field of potential until interaction occurs. We have a brain that doesn't passively receive reality, but actively constructs it. We have structural similarities between neural networks and the cosmic web. And we have this very uncomfortable, very persistent role of observation influencing outcomes. So the question becomes less, is this woo, and more, what is the nature of consciousness in all of this? Because traditional science has operated under the assumption that consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain. The neurons fire, complexity increases, consciousness emerges. Simple, clean, materialist. But there's a problem. Like, we still don't actually know how or why consciousness arises. And this is what's called the hard problem of consciousness. It's a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers. And the hard problem basically asks this: how do physical processes in the brain create subjective experience? And why does electrical activity feel like something? And why is there an inner world at all? Because we can map brain activity all day long. We can see which regions light up when you feel joy or fear or love, or when you remember that one thing that you said in 2007 that still fucking haunts you. But mapping the brain doesn't explain why it feels like anything to be you. Like, that gap is still wide open. So because of that gap, some scientists and philosophers have started exploring something that at first glance sounds wildly spiritual. It's called panpsychism. Now, before you roll your eyes and think I'm completely left the lab, just stay with me for a second. So panpsychism is the idea that consciousness is not something that suddenly appears at a certain level of complexity. It is something that exists in some form everywhere. And not that your coffee mug is having an existential crisis, but that the fundamental building blocks of reality may have proto-conscious properties, meaning that consciousness isn't produced by the universe, it is a feature of it. And then suddenly we are back in very familiar spiritual territory, because what has spirituality been saying forever? Consciousness is fundamental. Everything is interconnected. The universe is alive in some way. A different language, same direction. And now, let's layer in physics again, because this is where it gets even more interesting. So in quantum field theory, everything that exists is an excitation of an underlying field. So particles are not little billiard balls floating around. They are disturbances in fields, which means that you, me, your phone, your dog, your coffee, your existential crisis, all of it is patterns of energy arising within a unified field. Like, there's no hard separation, only differentiation within a whole. And now take that and combine it with what we know about the brain. Your consciousness arises from patterns of electrical and chemical activity, from information processing, from relationships between signals. And so, if consciousness arises from complex patterns and the universe itself is made of vast interconnected patterns, then the question becomes, why would consciousness stop at the skull? Like, why would it be limited to your brain? Why would the universe, orders of magnitude more complex than your brain, not have some form of awareness? And this is where we have to get really precise, because we're not saying that the universe is conscious like you're conscious. Like, I'm not just out there journaling about its feelings or wondering if Mercury retrograde is why things feel off, but it might be conscious in a way that is distributed and non-local and not centered in a single point, kind of like a field. And if that's true, then you are not separate conscious beings moving through an unconscious universe. You are a localized expression of a larger field of awareness, a node, a point of focus, a place where the universe becomes aware of itself in a very specific and very human way. And now let's bring this into spirituality, because this is where those ancient traditions start looking less like beliefs and more like the early frameworks for something that we are just now beginning to articulate scientifically. So in the Vedantic philosophy, there's this concept of Brahman, the ultimate reality, the universal consciousness from which everything arises. And in many indigenous traditions, there is no separation between humans and the living world. Everything is relational. Everything has spirit. In Hermeticism, the universe is described as a mental construct. The all is mind. And even in modern spiritual language, we talk about source and the field and collective consciousness. And science is over here like, hey, we have fields too. So what if we're not talking about different things? Like, what if we're looking at the same phenomenon just from different lenses, through one measurement and one through experience? Now, I want you to let this land in your body, because I don't want you floating off into the cosmic abstraction and forgetting that you still have to go to work tomorrow. Like, if you are a localized expression of a larger conscious system, then your awareness is not insignificant. It's not random and it's not separate. It is part of a larger process of the universe knowing itself, and that changes how you see everything. Because suddenly your thoughts are not just noise, and your awareness is not just accidental, and your existence is not just meaningless. You are participating in something much bigger than your individual identity. And I know it can feel like a lot, and I know it can feel expansive, but it can also feel grounding too. Or, it can feel like, cool, I need to go lay down immediately. Like, all of it's just so valid. But here's the integration point. You are still human. You still have a nervous system. You still have conditioning and patterns and habits and a lived experience that is very real. So this isn't about bypassing your humanity. It's about contextualizing it. Because if the universe is conscious in some way and you are a part of that, then your inner world and your outer world are not separate domains. They're just different expressions of the same underlying reality. And that brings us to the final piece, because now that we've explored the possibility that reality is constructed and observation influences outcome and consciousness might be fundamental, we have to ask the question that brings this all the way home. If your brain is your universe, how much of your life is being shaped by the way that you perceive it? And more importantly, can you change it? All right, so let's take a breath here, because we've gone from neurons to galaxies and from quantum fields to ancient philosophy and from your brain builds reality to the universe might be conscious. Like casual shit, right? But now we have to land this plane in your actual lived life, because if we don't, this just becomes another cool concept you heard on a podcast while doing laundry and then immediately fucking forgot when somebody texted you something mildly annoying. So let's bring it home. If your brain is constructing your experience of reality, if perception is a model, not the thing itself, if observation and interaction influence outcomes at the quantum level, and if consciousness may not be separate from the universe but an expression of it, then the question is no longer, is this true? The question becomes, what does this change about how I live? Because here's the truth most people don't want to sit with. You're not experiencing life as it is. You are experiencing life as you are. Through your conditioning, through your nervous system, through your beliefs and your wounds and your expectations and your identity. Your brain is constantly filtering reality through what it already knows, which means if your internal world is shaped by fear and scarcity and hypervigilance or old narratives, your external world will feel like it confirms that. And it's not because the universe is out to get you, but because your brain is wired to detect, prioritize, and reinforce patterns that match its model. This is neuroscience. It's predictive processing. It's also why healing feels like it changes your entire life without anything externally shifting immediately, because it does. When you regulate your nervous system, you change what feels safe. When you shift your beliefs, you change what your brain looks for. When you expand your awareness, you change how you interpret what's happening. And then suddenly, by the way, that same fucking reality feels different and looks different and responds differently. And now let's layer back in the quantum piece carefully, because we're not going to turn this into just think positive and your life will magically transform overnight. Like, we're not doing that. But what we are saying is this. If reality at its core is not fully fixed, and if systems are influenced by interaction, if observation is not neutral, then your engagement with your life matters. Your attention matters. Your state of being matters. Because attention is not just passive awareness. Attention is selection. Out of the infinite amount of data available to you at any given moment, your brain is constantly choosing what to focus on. And what you focus on becomes your experience. Not because you're ignoring reality, but because reality is too vast to experience all at once. So your brain filters. And those filters are programmable. This is where spirituality and neuroscience high-five each other, because spiritually, we talk about energy flows where attention goes, and what you focus on expands, and you create your reality. And then science goes, okay, yeah, but what we mean is that your brain reinforces neural pathways and strengthens perception loops and biases, interpretation toward familiar patterns. It's a different language, but it's the same mechanism. So now let's bring in the real question. If your brain is rendering your reality, who the fuck is in charge of the lens? Because for most people, that lens was shaped unconsciously by childhood and trauma and societal conditioning and repeated experiences that taught your brain that this is how the world works. And once your brain believes something is true, it doesn't just sit back and neutrally observe. It goes out and collects the evidence to support that belief. So if you believe that I'm not safe or I'm not enough or things never work out for me, your brain will scan your environment for proof of that. It'll highlight it. It'll remember it. It'll reinforce it. Not because it's trying to sabotage you, but because its job is to create a coherent, predictable model of reality. But now here's where your power comes in. Because once you become aware that your perception is a model, you're no longer fully trapped inside of it. You can start to question it and interrupt it and expand it. And this is where we get into actual grounded manifestation, not the fluffy kind, but the real kind. Manifestation is not about pretending reality is something that it's not. It's about changing the internal conditions that shape how you experience and interact with reality. It's about regulating your nervous system so that safety becomes your baseline, or rewiring beliefs so that possibility becomes visible, or expanding awareness so that you're not stuck in one narrow interpretation. And from that place, you move differently, you choose differently, you respond differently, and yeah, your life begins to reflect that. So, let's just zoom all the way out one last time. If the universe is a field, if you are a localized expression of that field, if your brain is the interface through which you experience it, then your life is not something happening to you. It is something happening through you. And that is both hugely empowering and deeply fucking humbling, because it means that you're not separate from reality. You're not powerless within it, but you're also not in total control. You are participating in a dynamic, evolving, responsive system, and maybe, just maybe, the goal isn't to control reality. It's to become more conscious within it, to refine your perception, to expand your awareness, to take responsibility for the lens that you're looking through. And when you do that, you don't just change what you see, you change how you exist. So if your brain is your universe, and then the most important question is not what is reality, it's who am I becoming inside of the reality that I'm creating? And if that question doesn't shift something inside of you, I don't know what will. You have been listening to the Synaptic Soul podcast, where science meets spirit and they totally make out. If this episode hit your frequency, do me a favor, rate it, review it, and share it with your fellow quantum weirdos. It helps the wavelength reach more souls. And if you caught a little snoring, that wasn't a portal, just my Frenchies Rocky and Rambo offering background blessings. Music is Cheat Code by 1,000 Hands, used under Creative Commons. And I am Ava Marie Anderson. Stay weird, stay wired, and keep making out with your higher self.